conditions in order to understand the whole digestive process. And that's where our notions of Pavlovian conditioning came from. But remember, he was a physiologist. He was interested in the physiology of digestion, so he focused on salivation. The standard Pavlovian paradigm is a stimulus like a metronome or a bell occurs, followed by food. And you've all seen that happening in the world. Here's, for instance, a lemon from my garden here in Tempe. Beautiful yellow astringent lemon. And if I were to bite into one of these now, oh, that's a good lemon. Oh. If I were to do that a few times, just seeing this, did anybody have sympathetic reactions? Yeah, it's such a strong effect that some people in the audience also found themselves salivating when I did. Classic Pavlovian conditioning. The situation also works if you just present food periodically, say once every minute. The food becomes both the unconditioned stimulus that elicits salivation and the conditioned stimulus, the sign that triggers it. So what happens if you do that, let's say with rats, as Tim Roper and others have, and feed them food every minute and chart out their behaviors? You'll see in the dashed line on the left, right after food, there's of course a lot of eating, and then the next line is D for drinking. Huge amount of what's called schedule-induced polydipsia, followed by A for general activity, G for grooming, L for lever pressing, they had to lever press to get food, and T for trade visits. A whole panoply of behaviors by the simple periodic feeding, Pavlovian conditioning. They didn't have to do anything, may not have known it. Why didn't Pavlov see that? Because this is how he conducted his experiments. His dogs were tethered. And he actually noticed some lunging at the food, and he just controlled it. He wasn't interested. But psychologists and behaviorists mistook the one thing he was curious about as constitutive of what the phenomenon was. And they thought, oh, it's stimulus substitution. The sign takes on properties of the thing that it signals. What happens if you unleash the dogs and replicate this experiment? A guy by the name of Herb Jenkins did that, put dogs in a scenario where you feed them periodically, and he found the whole concept of stimulus substitution is wrong. What you're doing is you're tapping into a natural architecture of behavior, and it resonates with that a CR should mean conditional release, not conditioned response. Release of what the animal comes prepared to do because of its evolutionary background. And it's a new look, but it's been around. Clive Wynne gave a very good talk on Pavlovian conditioning before and said as much as this, that a lot of things are going on in Pavlovian conditioning. So I want to segue now to the first person to talk about the law of effect. And his version of it, Edward Lee Thorndike, is as viable today as it was when he formulated it. He also said this: psychology is the science of intellects, characters, and behavior of animals, including man. Psychologists tend to study intellects and characters of man and behavior of animals. I think it's time we turned that around, got back to his original vision. He's most famous for this law of several responses made in the same situation, context matters. Those that are followed by satisfaction, closely followed by satisfaction, will, other things being equal, be more likely to recur. So this is selection, like Darwinian selection, of behaviors. And I'll be arguing later on that Pavlovian excitement gives rise to the variation principle as in evolution, and the law of effect gives rise to the selective function as in Darwinian conditioning or evolution. The greater the satisfaction, the greater the strengthening. This was an early version of what we'll later see as the law of effect. So effect is as in cause and effect. The effect of a behavior is what matters. It'll generate an increase in probability if it's followed by a pleasant affect satisfaction. And you know when a thing is a satisfier because animals will approach it. Independent measure of what satisfiers are. And he gave a functional definition. Those that watched Clive's talk last year, remember he talked about Brian Iwata's functional analysis, important way of finding out what's going on, and Thorndike did that early on as well. So this was his model of conditioning, and given a context and responses followed by a pleasurable state of affairs, there's an increase in the probability of responding. So as just a reminder of where we've come from so far, we have the British associationist, we're talking about connection of ideas using those principles. Pavlovian conditioning is the connection of sign to significant using the same principles. And Thorndike, connections of responses to context when they lead to satisfiers, and many of the same principles hold for him also. Well, this is getting to be a crowded field already, and how is a young wannabe scientist by the name of B.F. Skinner going to break into it and make his name and fortune? Well, he argued that we don't really know about pleasurable state of affairs for animal. It's adding an extra layer that we don't usually measure. We can be simpler than that, and we can just say, hey, anything that increases response rate, that's a reinforcer, and that's what we need to manipulate. In fact, there was a discussion in last year's Sparks. Ray Coppinger argued in response to a question, consciousness, dogs conscious? Maybe, maybe not. We can assume it or not. It'll make no difference in how we go about training animals or assuaging problems with them. The consciousness adds nothing extra. That was Skinner's position about emotions as well. So he said they refer to a subjective state of affairs. In point of fact, you know, if you look at the history of science, usually people make mountains out of molehills in order to establish their own turf. Thorndike really was in control of that issue, but by that point he had passed. So Skinner pruned the mediating states, and with them he didn't find it necessary to study approach or avoidance. What Skinner brought to bear were brilliant experiments. He was a tremendously creative experimenter. And looking at some of the other animal behavior studies that were happening at the time, where they used lots of rats and used statistics to analyze whether there was a significant effect or not, he once quipped, "Nobody goes to the circus to see an average dog jump through a hoop significantly more often than chance." Thorndike was the scientist. Skinner was the engineer. He got good results. He built good bridges to behavior. He was also an excellent philosopher. But that's a whole different story. So here's the hit parade of the 20th century. In textbooks, if you look at all the laws that were mentioned, number one is Weber's law, a law of relativity of perception. And after that, the law of effect, either Thorndike's or Skinner's version. And still in the top 10 are three other laws of connection. And if you look at the last 20 years of the 20th century, law of effect is still going strong, trending, continuing to trend. And all of a sudden, and down 8 and 10, we see more conditioning, laws of connection, and Primack's principle. Primack's principle. We'll talk a lot about that. It's Primack's law, but Primack's principle alliterates, and it's come to be known as Primack's principle. So the laws of effect say what it takes, what operations it takes to make one response stick to a stimulus or stick to another response. But what really gets glued by those? Pavlov glued hypothetical neural cells, brain cells. They sparked over when animals were conditioned. Thorndike knew about neurons, and he formulated an early version of Hebb's law. Neurons that fire together, wire together. Watson's glue was Pavlovian. John Broadus Watson, said to be the father of behaviorism, he just adopted Pavlovian conditioning and didn't worry about what mediated it. And Skinner adopted Thorndikean conditioning and didn't worry about either the neurons or the emotions that might mediate it. And so I want to do a little tangent now. Good conversations have lots of tangents in them. And give you a framework for how to think about whether we need to talk about neurons or not. What role do they play? And the person I learned this from is long dead, Aristotle. He lived over 2,000 years ago and argued that to understand a phenomenon, we need to have 4 questions answered. His term for questions or explanations was mistranslated as causes. So people talk about the 4 causes of Aristotle, but they're really B causes. So let me go back. So what you do is you take a phenomenon and put it in the crosshair. You pick out what you want to study. And let's suppose you see a dog walking along right next to its master's knee. And you say, what's going on here? That's the behavior. Aristotle said you want to know what triggers it, what caused it to start. What is it made of? What's the material substrate of that behavior? Why is it there? What purpose does it solve? And how do we talk about it? How we talk about it matters. It's a definition. You have to know what a good heel is and what a good heel isn't. And so the first thing to do is to name the phenomenon and describe it well. And then ask what stimuli occasion it. It might be a master's command with a chain or verbally. And what maintains it, what function it serves, and it's to get reinforcement for the dog, and the function for the master is to not have an unruly animal. And the neural connections, you have to know what those are to really understand the phenomenon, and that would be some dopamine release, I suppose, when food came. But you also should step back, take a larger view on this rather than a microscopic one and say, well, what makes that particular reinforcer work in that context work? And then you're talking about motivating operations, finding a state for the animal in which these things will be functional. You may want to, in terms of definitions, rise up to more general ones, like all the laws that we're talking about today. You want to ask, well, why is an animal reinforceable? Well, that's an evolutionary question, because they occupy a niche where sensitivity to the consequences of the behavior kept them and their pups or children alive. And then what is the architecture of a brain that can learn? So according to Aristotle, understanding something is a 4-footed beast. If you cut off one of the limbs, then your understanding is going to limp. All you do is focus on one, like nothing matters but the neural connections. Let's get an fMRI of the brain, and then we'll completely understand the behavior. Well, you only look at one limb of understanding or explanations, you've lost the heart of the phenomenon. All matter. I think Monique Udell made that point last year. So years passed. Let's turn to the not the textbooks, but the scientific journals. That's where the real action happens in understanding stuff. And you look at the 20th century, Weber's law is up there in journals, and another law of perception. Weber's law is about relativity. We're sensitive to percentage changes, not absolute amount of changes. Stevens' power law of perception, law of effect still hanging strong in the scientific literature. But you look at the last decade, and whoa, what happened here? Law of effect is down to number 8. Don't we believe it anymore? And what is this matching law? Well, the matching law is the law of effect. It's formulated by this guy, one of my thesis examiners, and it's the same old reinforcement strengthens behavior, but now we measure the strength not by rate or probability, but by relative rate or proportion of responding. So in that equation in the lower left, if you can see it, it's a proportion. It says if we're interested in behavior 1, B1, and we can form this ratio of that response to all other responses in the animal's environment. And we can predict it very well by the proportion of reinforcers that it's getting, of rewards that it's getting for that response. This is another version of it we don't have time for. It was very effective law. The dots are data points. This is from the original article that he wrote the law in. And the proportion of reinforcements is on the x-axis, and if the law is true, all the data will fall along that line. And they do. It's been replicated many times. Sometimes there's small systematic deviations, but it's a solid law. But, and I say this as a person that wrote his dissertation on this topic, so I know what I'm talking about, it's constrained to a fairly narrow situation, things like rats pressing on 2 levers for food delivered according to particular schedules that may or may not be operative in the worlds we live in, as opposed to the laboratory world. So it's a lovely law for what it does, but it may not be really relevant to what you do or want to know about, but you should know what it is. You might find a use for it. This guy, however, you will find a use for his law. It's David Primack. He's always been sort of an outsider, very smart guy that did experiments that didn't fit into the tradition, and people scratched their heads. They didn't know what to do about it. You could see it in his eyes. He's ailing now. I don't think he's going to be long with us, but he's sort of one of my heroes of behavior scientist, theorist, and formulated a principle that he said, wait a minute, folks, wake up. Things don't reinforce us. Behaviors reinforce us. Well, you think about it, there's a lot of face validity to that. If you think about what you like to do, you might like to play golf, you might like to cook, you might like to play a musical instrument, you might like to play racquetball, you might like to make love. But it's not like you're doing that for a thing, you're doing that for an activity. If you were reading a Jack Reacher mystery novel, I said, you can stop now. Jack's boss is the one that killed him. I wouldn't consummate your pleasure, you know? You'd throw the book at me. You like the behavior. We have to look at behaviors. It's not food in the mouth, it's not pellets in the mouth, it's eating food, perhaps, or other activities. And when you think of it that way, it causes us to reframe everything. So he did many creative experiments. The same response, like running in a running wheel by rats, could be used to reinforce drinking, because they were in a cramped cage and they would drink water if they had to run in the running wheel. Or you could just withhold water and make them run in the running wheel in order to get water. The same behavior could be a reinforcer or a reinforced act. Many creative experiments. But because my friend Jesus Rosales Ruiz has a lovely video on YouTube where he uses the Primack principle. He's got a dog. He does this with a couple different dogs, some that are barking too much for affiliation, they want to play, and others that are barking too much for aggression. They want to push the other dog away. And the last one I saw, this other dog was barking aggressively at any dog in its sight. And so he would bring a dog up to it. He'd go way back here and move up just till the dog starts barking and sit down the helper dog till the dog stops, and then walk away. So the behavior that it took for the target dog to get this dog to move away was being quiet. And it was marvelous. Over the course of about 15 or 20 of these experiments, the dog stopped barking to make the other dog go away. Primack principle is usable in your practice. So here's all the things we're looking at so far, lots of stuff. And the thing I want to move to next is the observation of Thorndike, that we can identify what's a satisfying state of affairs by knowing what animals will approach or avoid. Powerful. I'm going to call it, it's my name, the law of attraction. I'm going to give you a lot of data on it because it's cool. And it's really powerful and important effect. Wallace Craig, 100 years ago, at the time a well-thought-of ethologist, although they didn't have that word for him then, argued that all instincts are realized as directed motion towards goals and away from anti-goals. Clark Hall, a more modern behaviorist, movement towards goals and away from anti-goals are so obvious in animal behavior they can't be overlooked. Schenerian, another good ethologist. Approach and withdrawal are the only empirical objective terms applicable to all motivated behavior in all animals. Whoa, why haven't people talked about this more? Logan introduced incentive motivation that were stimuli set the occasion on which other stimuli would be attractive, or they themselves would be attractive. Panksepp argued that there's a primal tendency for animals to move where it needs to be. Everybody agrees. Well, of course, you look at the world and that's how it is. And when you get everybody agreeing, you get even the devil himself agreeing. Freud's pleasure principle, that our entire psychical activity is bent upon procuring pleasure and avoiding pain. Well, once you get that kind of unanimity, you get the philosophers and poets in on the act. And the great philosopher poet Paul Simon sang, "The heart approaches what it yearns." Well, with this groundswell, clearly politicians have to get into the act. And they were there long before the rest. Thomas Jefferson et al. Declared, not only do we do it, we have an inalienable right to the pursuit of happiness. Okay? So there's agreement, but sometimes, despite all the agreement of experts in the world, the story's wrong. So I'm going to give you some data. I think the story was wrong about what constitutes a reinforcer. It's not a thing. It's not a stimulus. It's a behavior. And all the experts were agreeing until Primack came along. They didn't know what to do with them. So here's some data. I could be pulling out the lemon again, but I won't put you through that pain. A standard Pavlovian conditioning procedure, if we have unfettered animals, invariably, with a period of time in which CS, a sign, comes up, followed by a biologically important event, like food to a hungry animal, animals will approach and make contact with that sign. It's been found in 20 different species, pretty much anywhere it's been looked for. They found it in cuttlefish, and cows, and cowbirds, and chickens, and dogs, and humans. And one of the original investigators of this, a guy named Jenkins was one, and Elliot Hurst was another. Elliot is an interesting person. He was a good chess player. In fact, he was the last person to have beaten Bobby Fischer in chess. He was very good, very smart. But here, he instituted a diabolical experiment, okay, to demonstrate sign tracking. Pigeon in a long box, maybe 3 meters long or more. With a food cup, it can't quite reach behind it on the floor here. And on the left side, that little gray disc can be illuminated with a light. And after a minute or so, it is illuminated, and 5 seconds later, the food hopper comes up for 3 seconds and goes down. So if their predictions are correct, the pigeon will move over to the light and peck it and come back. And this is what happens. It can't make it down and back in time. So obviously it will stop doing that. No, it doesn't stop doing that. It keeps going way out of its way to peck the stimulus, and keeps getting back in time to see the hopper disappear just as it reaches it. Eventually it stops, it gets to eat a bit, and the light gets to be a good predictor again, so it goes down and starts pecking the light and comes back again. This is such a frustrating experience, it drives some pigeons to contemplate suicide. But it causes others to evolve. This is a bird watcher. There was a nice experiment shown at tape where Nathan, a student with Clive Wynne, was doing therapy for a dog that would charge after flashes of light. And I want to show it to you. He did some nice therapy I won't have time to talk to you about. Any flashes of light, like reflections from his collar, he'd try to get the light. So I want you to see if you can see when sign tracking is happening here. You go for the source. The flashes are the sign of the more potent light, and the light predicts seeing the flash. It's when that light comes on over there, then you see a flash. So you go and charge after the light. It's such a reliable phenomenon. You can do lots of cool experiments about approach avoidance and vary conditions of reinforcement. You get orderly laws that I won't bore you with now. You can actually also vary the wavelength, the similarity of the light to the light that illuminates the food. Blau always does beautiful experiments this way. And the time before food that the light comes on. And you get this smooth silhouette of data points you call a gradient, because you go along this direction of similarity, or this one of proximity in time, or another one of proximity in space, and you get more and more responses. So it's this beautiful space-time continuum that mediates proximity. Proximity means in all of these dimensions, they have graded effects on approach withdrawal, and they have graded effects on assigning causal status to events. So there's no question about these things. And lots of people then generated theories about these space-time similarity gradients. But mostly, it's laborious collecting those data. And mostly they are pretty models that don't tell us much more than the facts themselves. So what are satisfiers? They're things an animal wants, such as a higher rate of reinforcement than the environment it's in now. Or they can be contexts that move it towards different but more valued reinforcers. More satisfying state of affairs. Now, it's a lot of stuff that I've laid out on you, and what I'd like to do now is give you a framework that I think connects all of these dots in one picture. And I'm going to call it a unified theory of connection. Just didn't need a name. And it's based on this ethogram. An ethogram is a layout of what the animals do in particular situations. Bill Timberlake has been pushing this in our field for a number of years. And people nod their heads, but they don't use it as much as they should. So there can be different subsystems: predatory, sexual, defensive. And one of them, say a predatory, you can talk about different general modes of classes of action that an animal can engage in, such as general search or handling and consuming. And then to the right, that column are modules. Well, in general search, they could do those things. And in traveling, there are a number of ways they could travel in terms of concrete actions. Like they could run, they could crawl over, they could swim. So you have this hierarchy of actions that get more particular to the right. My unified theory of connections is that reinforcement is constituted by the ability to move down through these modules to actions that are more valued, because they're typically closer to, if the animal's in predatory mode, closer to swallowing in the end. And any stimulus that signals you can move to the next module is approached. It is a satisfier. And any of the particular varieties of actions in the rightmost column that gets you there the fastest is reinforced and learned. So we have in the module column Pavlovian conditioning. Signs that you can make the transition are approached and release a set of relevant behaviors. And the actions themselves that are released are selected from by Schenerian conditioning. So this is simple when you think about it. It's obvious, and it's obviously true, that reinforcers are responses, not stimuli. More probable and more reinforcing responses are the ones, you have to figure out how to arrange this hierarchy for this to be true, but once you have, it's true that moving through the hierarchy matters, and that's signs of the transition are satisfiers, Thorndikean, are approached, Thorndike, Pavlov sign tracking. They elicit other species-typical reactions, like we saw with dogs unfettered and rats unfettered, and they reinforce the response to lead to them. That's B.F. Skinner, Schenerian conditioning. Moving from one mode to another sets the occasion, in a technical term of art, they say, for what stimuli are effective and what class is most likely. So it's like the animal has a repertoire. And when it's in a particular general search versus handle consume mode, there's a set of behaviors, set of modules that are more likely because they've always been more relevant to that. And so the notion of motivating operations or occasion setters are about moving between different modes in this hierarchy. Works for humans too, of course. Tori Higgins done a lot of work as a social psychologist with these things. But if we go back to Thorndike, he was saying it all along. Just look at the bottom paragraph here. When a child sees an attractive object at a distance, his neurons may be said to prophetically prepare for the whole series of fixating with the eyes, running towards it, seeing it within reach, grasping, feeling it in his hand, curiously manipulating it. It's just what we've been talking about. And the details of what lets him hit the next stage become signs, and the details of how he does that became conditioned responses. With humans, Higgins shown that you can identify two systems, probably others. He focused on promotion focus and prevention focused. A lot of cool experiments. The bottom line on these is, if you want to sell a person a car, you've got to get them in a promotion focus. Oh man, it's a great day out there. You want to get out to Sedona, you got to hit the road. Life is good, let's move forward. Promotion focus. You want to sell them car insurance. Oh, it's a dangerous highway out there. You never know you don't want to lose your whole house because, you know, you have to do those things. Good salesmen, of course, do. And then all the other behaviors that are released are much more likely. We've said all of that already. Sometimes animals get stuck at some of these spots. In fact, sometimes the actions become reinforcing in themselves without leading on to other things. Habit is motive in the making. Daisy got stuck at chasing until Clive got her out by quantum tunneling down that. We breed animals to get stuck. We breed dogs to be immobile when they see prey. We call them pointers. We breed others to get down most of the list, bring the food back to the den, but not to chew or swallow. We call them retrievers, and so on. You can figure out where all of these are stuck. And sometimes they're in one of these modes, and it's not so much that they're stuck there, is that they're not motivated to take strong action about it. So there are a number of movies of lioness befriending fawns. Perhaps they've lost a cub of their own or whatever. And they not only befriend it, but they guard it. But as the great observer of human behavior pointed out, and animal behavior, Woody Allen, yea, the lion shall lay down with the lamb, but the lamb shall not get very much sleep. And Craig Packer said that these affairs always end in tears. And so eventually, mama gets hungry and things move on. So what we learn in these actions are more efficient routes down that chain of actions. You can talk about geodesics in space-time behavior. Behavior is a trajectory through a field of attractors and signs of attractors. And what path you're on depends on what motivating operations, what subsystems you're in at the time. Conditioned stimuli in Pavlovian terms, or discriminative stimuli, are signposts on that journey. If they're extrinsic to the animal, it's Pavlovian sign learning. If the signs are like my hand on the lever leads to food, I approach my hand on the lever by putting it there, and we call that Schenerian conditioning. And it can be either attraction or repulsion, depending on the nature, the sign of the ultimate behavior. What role does affect play? It plays two kinds of roles. One is satisfiers are part of the reinforcement package. And another, this is a well-received version of emotion in humans. And if you look at the quadrants here, it's called the circumplex. If you look at the quadrants, everything in the left upper quadrant shouts avoid. Everything in the right upper quadrant says, hey, it's good, go there, get it, engage in appropriate behaviors. And sometimes the world is ambiguous enough, or our posture in it is, that we better just lay low and wait. So my argument is that emotions are the signatures of different behavioral modes. They tell us, it doesn't have to be conscious, but they tell us what kinds of things we should be doing. They prime the neural system, as Thorndike says they should, and inhibit competing systems and enable that action. So, what we've said, the laws of connection. Transitions to context of more potent positive actions are pleasurable or satisfying. And emotions remind us of which modes we're in. And it doesn't, I guess it doesn't have to be conscious. We just sometimes don't feel like doing this, we feel like doing that. That stimuli that are good predictors of motion down the behavioral chains are learned. It's called Pavlovian sign learning. The law of effect helps fine-tune the behaviors that get you from one to the other. And it's really all about access to actions that matters, and Primack principle. These are the things that tune our system to be ready for one kind of action or another kind of action. That reinforcement constitutes movement through one of these. Which ones depends on the mode. If it's a defensive mode, Bowles called these species-specific defense reactions, and there's a whole other predatory imminence. There's a whole other scheme for that. And then finally, this is my suggested game to you for the rest of the conference. Whenever for each new talk that you attend, think about, okay, what quadrant, at what depth is this speaker focusing on? Most experts have to focus on one or the other, but they should touch base on all of them and see if you can build up a full map of understanding of animal behavior. And if you can't, I want you to complain to Prescott Breeden that, hey, you left a quadrant out. We need somebody talking about X next time. I appreciate connecting with you all. I've hoped I've made understanding, conditioning, and training and the laws of connection hang together a bit more for you. But all of this stuff is words and is models. To really know that it works, you have to put it in practice. The rubber meets the road when you're actually engaging actions. And that's why you all are listening in or all here today. And so this might give you a framework for doing it effectively, but doing it rather than just thinking about it is what matters. Thank you. When you're actually engaging actions. And that's why you all are listening in or all here today. And so this might give you a framework for doing it effectively, but doing it rather than just thinking about it is what matters. Thank you.